What happens when a routine traffic stop turns into a career-ending mistake? A racist cop thought he had the upper hand, but little did he know, the man he arrested was the Attorney General. What unfolds next will leave you speechless. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that dragged on endlessly. Sergeant Marshall sat slouched in his patrol car, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Nothing exciting had happened all day, and his patience was wearing thin. He was itching for action, for the chance to show who was in control. Then, as if on cue, a sleek and black sedan came into view. It wasn't speeding, but something about the way it moved confident and deliberate caught Marshall's eye. The driver, a black man in an expensive suit, exuded an air of authority that immediately rubbed Marshall the wrong way. "Got one," he muttered to himself, flipping on his lights. The sedan obediently pulled over, but instead of the nervous or apologetic behavior Marshall expected, the driver remained calm. Too calm. Marshall approached the window, his irritation growing with each step. The man lowered the window, meeting Marshall's gaze with steady, composed eyes. "License and registration," Marshall barked. The man handed over his documents without a word. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. "You were speeding," Marshall lied, smirking slightly. The man raised an eyebrow. "I was going 35 in a 40 zone. Marshall felt his blood boil. He hated that tone, the way this man spoke to him like an equal, like he wasn't afraid. "Step out of the vehicle," Marshall demanded sharply. The man hesitated. "On what grounds? Don't make me use force," Marshall sneered, his hand hovering near his cuffs. The man sighed but complied, stepping out of the car and placing his hands on the hood without resistance. "You're making a mistake, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Oh, I decide what's a mistake," Marshall snapped. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slapped on the cuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting." The man didn't struggle, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor. His gaze wasn't panicked or angry. Instead, it was calm, almost assessing, like he was silently calculating every move Marshall made. "You'll regret this," the man said simply as Marshall led him to the patrol car. Marshall laughed. "We'll see about that." Back at the precinct, Marshall shoved the man into an interrogation room chair with unnecessary force. "Take a seat, boss," he said mockingly, slamming the door shut. The man, who introduced himself as Derek Williams, sat upright, his arms crossed. Unlike most detainees, he didn't show a hint of fear or anger. His calm, composed demeanor only irritated Marshall further. "What's your name?" Marshall asked as he began filling out the paperwork. "Derek Williams," the man replied. For a brief moment, the name sounded familiar, but Marshall dismissed the thought. "You act like you're special," Marshall said, glaring at him. "Think that fancy suit impresses anyone?" Derek didn't respond. Instead, he smirked faintly, the look of someone who knew far more than he was letting on. Frustrated, Marshall stormed out of the room and headed to the duty desk. "Run his name," he barked at Officer Johnson. Johnson typed the name into the system, but as soon as the results appeared, his face turned pale. Dan," Johnson stammered. "What?" Marshall snapped impatiently. "You just arrested the state attorney general," Johnson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marshall froze. "You're joking," he said, his voice suddenly shaky. Wordlessly, Johnson turned the screen toward him. There, staring back at Marshall, was Derek Williams' official government photo. Beside it, in bold letters, was his title, State Attorney General. Marshall's stomach churned. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Johnson hissed. "That man oversees law enforcement for the entire state. He's known for going after corrupt cops, and you just arrested him on a fake charge." Marshall's mind raced. "Maybe he won't make a big deal out of it," he muttered weakly. "Are you insane?" Johnson said, his voice rising. "Look outside." Marshall turned to the window and felt his heart drop. A crowd of reporters had already gathered outside the precinct. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved forward, and the sound of shouting voices filled the air. Just then, the interrogation room door opened. Derek walked out, flanked by the lieutenant and the precinct chief. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was now a glint of steel in his eyes. "Officer Marshall," Derek said, his voice steady but commanding. "I strongly suggest you find a good lawyer." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, placing it on the desk. "Oh, and one more thing," Derek added, leaning in slightly. "I'll personally make sure to end your hearing." Marshall stood frozen, unable to respond as Derek walked out of the precinct. Outside, the cameras went wild, reporters shouting questions over one another. Derek ignored them. his every step exuding confidence and authority. The weight of the situation hit Marshall like a freight train. His career was over, his name was tarnished, and his actions would soon be the subject of national outrage. By the time the courtroom filled with journalists, spectators, and legal experts, Marshall's name had become a symbol of everything wrong with systemic abuse of power. No one could believe that an ordinary police officer would dare to arrest the state attorney general. Sergeant Dan Marshall sat at the defendant's table, his face flushed with tension. He had been told this was just a routine legal procedure, but deep down he knew something was wrong. The courtroom door swung open, and Derek Williams walked in. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, exuding authority with every step. He moved deliberately, his calm demeanor silencing even the skeptics. Marshall instinctively clenched his fist as Williams passed by, their eyes meeting for a brief but intense moment. If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time. Court is now in session. The judge's gavel struck sharply. Today, we are hearing the case of the alleged unlawful arrest of Attorney General Derek Williams by Sergeant Daniel Marshall. Marshall swallowed hard, his throat dry and his palms clammy. Prosecutor Williams stood, his voice calm but commanding. Your Honor, I request that this trial be made fully public. The people deserve to see how their justice system truly operates. The judge nodded without hesitation. Proceed, he said, gesturing for the trial to begin. The first piece of evidence was damning. A large screen displayed a video of the arrest, showing Marshall demanding that Williams exit his car without cause. The footage continued, revealing how he had roughly handcuffed Williams. Gasps of shock echoed throughout the courtroom as murmurs swept through the audience. Sergeant Marshall Williams began, his voice as cold as steel. You claimed I resisted arrest. Do you see any sign of resistance in this video? Marshall's throat tightened as he struggled to respond. Not exactly, he stammered. You fabricated the charge, Williams pressed, his tone unwavering. I was just doing my duty, Marshall blurted out, instantly regretting his words. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order in the court. Williams didn't falter. The truth is, Sergeant, you are merely a product of a system that has enabled police misconduct for far too long. Today, this courtroom is not just deciding your fate, but addressing the injustices suffered by many under this broken system. His words hung heavy in the air. An hour later, the judge's ruling sent shockwaves through the room. Sergeant Marshall, you are hereby suspended from duty, and criminal charges for abuse of power will be filed against you. Marshall sat frozen, his world crumbling around him. Williams rose from his seat and exited the courtroom without so much as a glance back. 2 weeks passed since the trial, and Marshall's life had spiraled into chaos. He sat in his dimly lit apartment, smoke from his cigarette curling into the air. The news blared on the TV: police scandal, racist arrest of the Attorney General. His own face appeared next to Derek Williams on the screen. Damn it, he muttered, reaching for a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He had always believed the system would protect him, but now, with the public watching, everyone had turned their backs. His badge no longer carried the weight it once did. The next morning, Marshall arrived at the station, only to find that his ID no longer worked. Sergeant, you're suspended, the receptionist said without meeting his gaze. You know this is all just politics, Marshall snapped. I was following orders, the receptionist only sighed. They want you at headquarters. At headquarters, the mood was grim. The police commissioner and a team of lawyers waited in silence. Sergeant Marshall, you're under internal investigation, the commissioner began. Marshall exhaled sharply, his temper flaring. This is all because of that damn Williams, isn't it? The commissioner's expression didn't change. Not just Williams. We've reviewed your past cases, complaints, violations, video evidence. You've drawn too much negative attention, Dan. We can't ignore it anymore. You're throwing me away like garbage. Marshall barked, his voice rising. You're toxic now. The commissioner replied coldly. The department needs a new image, and you don't fit into it. Marshall felt his world collapse. 20 years of service meant nothing now. A week later, formal charges were filed. Excessive use of force, falsifying reports, systematic discrimination, the list seemed endless. Marshall's lawyer didn't mince words. Dan, this is serious. Take the plea deal. You'll get probation, but you'll lose your badge for good. I'm not pleading guilty, Marshall growled. His lawyer sighed, sliding a phone across the table. On the screen, a recording played, Marshall's own voice, cold and damning. They're always hiding something. You have to make them fear you. This is a setup. Marshall snapped, but his lawyer's gaze remained steady. No, Dan. This is accountability. You can't outrun the truth. The final trial was broadcast live, with cameras capturing every moment. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Marshall sat at the defendant's table, his fists clenched tightly. He refused to meet the crowd's gaze, his pride battered beyond recognition. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Daniel Marshall, this court finds you guilty on all charges. You are permanently barred from law enforcement and sentenced to 3 years of probation. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience, some clapping softly at the verdict. Marshall stared at the floor, defeated. He had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and his sense of invincibility. But the worst part wasn't the verdict. It was Derek Williams, standing in the back of the courtroom, watching him with an expression devoid of anger or satisfaction. As they crossed paths in the hallway, Marshall couldn't contain his bitterness. "Are you happy now?" he growled. Williams adjusted his cufflinks with a small, deliberate motion. "Justice was served, Sergeant." Marshall's lips curled in a snarl. "Go to hell." Williams paused, looking Marshall in the eye. "The system isn't broken, Marshall. It just doesn't work for you anymore." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Marshall alone with his shattered illusions. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, celebrating what they called a victory for justice. For Marshall, however, it was the beginning of a long, lonely fall from grace.